just have a conversation about how the church should respond to some of the things that we've been thinking about today thus far. And I was very struck right at the beginning, actually, by something that was said at the beginning. I think it was Nigel that said it. But the questions in our mind that robotics bring to the fore. So for you, as Christians and as involved in leadership in various ways in the church, what, as you've listened and as you've thought around the issues anyway for yourselves, are the big questions that our discussions today have brought to the fore as a church leader? Paul, can I ask you first?
I think the big question for us, we've got a relatively young church. I'm the pastor of a church here in London. My background is in theoretical physics. That was what I studied at university. But now I'm a pastor. And though my congregation is a young one, I'm just about the oldest person in the congregation. Now, that may not be a yardstick to many of you. But most of my congregation, the adults, are in their 30s and 40s. And there's a lot of single people and a lot of children. I think the question for me is how to reach the youngest ones. The 30s and 40s, by and large, don't get this. I think the 20s do a bit, but the ones who are going to really get it are the children. Have those two pictures arrived, which I've got? This is from yesterday. And the previous one, the other one, yeah. This is partly because I'm the proudest grandfather in the world. And the one in the middle is called Poppy. And that was Harrods Toy Department the day before yesterday, which, taking a day off, my wife and I took her to. In the Harrods Toy Department, which is a very good place to go for a day out, because it's absolutely free, provided you don't buy anything, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of fluffy toys. Now, she has quite a few fluffy toys at home, and she quite enjoyed being with the fluffy toys, and she picked up lots of them and cuddled lots of them. But the other picture is the one that really interested her. And the Lego girl was one whose hand she wanted to hold for about a quarter of an hour. Now, what's going on in her brain, and what's different about her brain to the brain of all the other children older in my church, and indeed the adults? We've got, by the way, she is 1.5. We have got to reach the 1.5-year-olds.
Thank you. It's a challenge for us, isn't it? Mal, do you want to come in a bit in relation to those big issues as church leaders for you?
My apologies that I wasn't around for most of this morning because I was coming back from somewhere else. What you just said is absolutely true, and I think that the generation that's emerging now, we call them millennials between early 20s and mid-30s. My children are all millennials. My grandchildren, like yours, are Generation Edge, which is under that, and they're very different. They're not as idealistic as millennials. They're much more pragmatic. How is this going to work? How can the rubber hit the road? But I think they are naturally more wired for talking about automation. For them is a very normal thing. There's nothing revolutionary about it. And in a sense, we have to get over our own shock at what's happening around us and start to engage it and embrace it as if we're proactive in the process rather than reacting to change. Otherwise, we will lose their interest and we will lose their respect. So I think you're absolutely right. And we can learn so much from them. Microsoft has taken to a thing called reverse mentoring, as has IBM, where younger people teach older people about things they know better than we do. And the church is a good place to institute that.
Matt, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, certainly I'd echo all of what's been said so far. My experience, as you'll know from the biographical details, I lead several programs now at St Mary's University looking at the ethics behind many of the new technologies. And kind of coming from the tradition of the university and its history, we do get a number of clergy coming on to our programs, and those that are serving in kind of a chaplaincy role within hospitals. So trying to empower and inform them from a Christian basis in order to fulfill their role is one particular focus that I've been interested in over the last couple of years. And what seems to be kind of one of the prevalent themes coming through is understanding how ethics applies to many of these technologies that they're finding on the wards, caring for patients. What is the human factor to caring, and what does the Christian faith have to say about a model of care, and how can that be applied? So what it means to be human, it's a phrase that we use many times, but I think it is a deep question, and one that we kind of take 2 or 3 years to unpack on the MA, but that kind of fundamental question is really kind of the basis for what I think underpins much of what we're talking about today.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So we talked about the challenges, but actually we've alluded to the fact in a number of the talks that actually we as the church are, or should be, salt and light in our societies. You could be a scaremonger if you start thinking of some of the things we've been talking about. How should the church respond? What are the opportunities? Paul?
Nigel talked. Hello? Are we still on? Nigel talked about the middle ground. And I think one of our responsibilities, opportunities, but a huge responsibility as well, is to help young people to occupy the middle ground between a fear of technology on the one hand, or an unthinking swallowing of technology, uncritically, hook, line, and sinker. So that's the challenge. Just with children, some very practical things. I was just jotting 1 or 2 things down through this morning. Some very practical things that we've taken on. And these are some low-hanging fruit. Messy Church. We've all heard about Messy Church. Did you know there's a Messy Church in Science program? And it's got 50 activities. Instead of just playing with spaghetti and elastic bands, you play with spaghetti and elastic bands with scientific experiments for 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and teaching them something about the world which God has created and the God who made the world. So there's a very sort of simple, easy thing to do. I was at a science conference in Oxford last week with some very eminent physicists. The conference rather grandly called itself Experimental Tests in Quantum Reality. This was hard science. This was not just sort of philosophical waving of wands in the air. This was hard science. But people were coming up with ideas like this. Let's overcome, and somebody mentioned it, was it you, Rob? You mentioned, how are we going to overcome some of the traps that we fell into in the past over evolution, over sexuality, and so on? Well, wouldn't it be great if our children learnt about evolution in church before they heard about it in school? That's a simple takeaway that we're going to put into practice.
You've also, Paul, can I just ask, well, thinking of those who are slightly older, you've also got quite an interesting initiative with some of the professionals who are in your church in relation to what they're reading. Can you unpack some of that?
At a slightly older level, I mean, any church that's a sort of medium-sized church can gather together people who are alert to these issues. The majority may not be, but a small minority will be. And they can be sensitized, energized, they can be brought into teaching, seminars and sermons and so on in your congregation. So I've gathered in our church here in London a group of people who are interested in these issues. One is a neuroscientist. He's not a Christian believer, but he's a very understanding and sympathetic guy who, both for his expertise in neuroscience and the fact that he's not yet would call him. He said he called himself an atheist a few years ago, and now he's an agnostic. So he's a very, very interesting person to be interacting with. There's a mathematician who did some of the main mathematical modelling for the spread of pandemics, who predicted what was going to happen with Ebola, what was going to happen with the spread of AIDS and so on, and the containment of AIDS. There's a synthetic biologist from Imperial College. There's a science teacher. There's a guy who's doing experimental advanced stuff in dental surgery. Dental surgery is where some of the nanotechnology is making some of its greatest strides. So I've just gathered these people together, and we meet together several times a year. We give ourselves something to read or watch, and then we talk about these things, and then we try in some way to infiltrate the rest of the congregation with the sort of things we're talking about.
Great idea. Mal, can you...
In my observation, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but the book of Acts, 85% of private conversations are with people of influence. Today we would call them policymakers or marketplace leaders. You consider, Lydia, you consider Dionysius, you consider the Philippian jailer who's a bureaucrat, not just a man with keys. And 85% in my estimation of conversations are with people. I think the church does need to get involved with the policymakers and those who have within their day-to-day grasp the opportunity to shape some of the thinking on these areas. We may not directly be able to do it, but we can perhaps align ourselves, as you're doing so well, with people who can. The other thing I'd say is, I remember as a youth pastor in the 1980s being asked all the time by parents, how can I stop my kids seeing the wrong movies? And the answer to that is, well, you can't unless you want kids that don't think for themselves. But what you can do is tell them to ask the right questions about the movies they see. And I think it's the same with technology, and not just with young people. We can be proactive by teaching people simple questions to ask about any new technology they encounter or hear about. Like, how can this technology help me in my stewardship of time and resources, for example? How can this new technology be used for Christian witness, but in a non-predictable way, in a surprising way that provokes curiosity and causes people to ask me why I think this way. Questions about how can it help me relate better to human beings? We might change the way we use social media if we thought more about that, the face-to-face time. So I think there's a series of questions we can ask people of all ages and teach them to ask for themselves about any new technology.
And if I could add to that, I think, I mentioned one or two of the very practical things, but the big challenge is to be helping our congregations, and especially our young people, to be asking those existential questions. Our young people are now asking a completely different form of question from the one that we asked when, for example, we were in the youth groups. When we were in the youth groups as teenagers, we were asking the question, can I do what I like? Can I do what I want? And that was addressed by the churches, unfortunately, in a rather moralistic fashion. Churches should be places of good news, but actually to young people, we tended to give good advice, telling them what they can and can't do. But it's not the question anymore. They're not asking, what can I do? They're asking, who can I be? Not can I do what I like, but can I be who I like? Now, the autonomous right to self-determination in regard to our own body goes way back, a long, long way, but there have been gear change moments, haven't there? 1967, the Abortion Act, and now the transgender movement is just the latest form of it. But that's the question, not can I do what I like, but can I be whoever I like? And that's not a question when I was a teenager I was asking. But we've got to help the young people to be able to fathom that question and turn it into the sub-questions that it's going to pan out to.
So there are big discipleship issues here, aren't there, about how we care for and teach the people that we have in our charge. That's one area. Do you think there are other areas of discipleship? We've touched on employment and what the world of work might look like in the future. Is there a fundamental issue there in relation to how we disciple people?
Yeah, I think we can refresh in young people's minds certainly a theology of work, understand them, help them understand where work is in God's order, what it's meant to produce in us, what it's not meant to produce in us, who's the master and who's the slave in order to work. The Latin word addictus referred to the 10-year period that an indentured servant would serve the master, and the addict was the servant. And we have to decide in our workspace, am I the addict serving my addictus, or am I something else? So the theology of work would be important. And just to come off the back of that, I think that John Stott years ago said, and it was very well put, he said, we're no longer in a place of offering young people an apologetic for faith, as in evidence for this and evidence for that. He said it's now become an ethical apologetic. And I see that all the time, people in church and outside who want to know the interface between faith and the ethics. What's the right thing to do? How do I apply it in a non-binary situation? And I think we can have more to say, even to our congregants, on those sorts of issues, even if we're not ethicists.
So we've been focusing on the people in our care and the people in our churches, but of course we're called to be salt and light to our communities around us and to work for the good of the city. So what are the implications of some of this in terms of the opportunities that the church has to really be in the forefront of dealing with some of these issues in our communities?
Should we give Matt a chance to say something?
Yes.
And technically the non-church congregational leader of the panel. Talking from personal experience, I know being engaged in this space intrigues many people that I come across. So I know in my own personal experience, various churches in the locality are in discussions with me to try and see if we can do something together in terms of discussion that we can begin to start talking about the impact of new technologies and a whole life discipleship approach. You know, how do these impact upon how does this impact upon the housewife or the teacher, and really begin to start thinking about those things and giving space for that. So opportunities from churches from different styles, different sizes, different backgrounds, different makeup, coming together, because it's all going to affect us all in that way. And I think asking and being open to ask questions and not necessarily be afraid of not knowing the answers, but asking the question. I know John Stott's being mentioned, but the whole art of double listening, I think there is tremendous power in that. And just having coffee with friends informally and just exploring with them what their questions are about some of these technologies, and allowing them to think, well, okay, what does it say in X magazine or X newspaper, and how the Bible speaks to that. And there's got to be those connections that we make.
I really echo that. The church has a message to the world, but the world has a lot to teach the church as well. And one of the problems in this area is the world has often been ahead of the game and asking the questions that the church ought to be asking and ought to be giving some of the answers to. With this eminent group of scientists I was with last week, I was struck by their humility. Repeatedly, they said, these are people right at the top of their field, and they would say things like, we know very, very little. In fact, the more we know, we don't know. But we're curious. That's the sort of thing they would say. We just play all day being curious. And it's such a pity when the church isn't curious and curious to learn from the world in that double listening that you're talking about. So just one very practical idea that's come up recently. In our interface with the local community, doing the sort of things that people outside the church or on the fringe of the church might come to, we've come up with the idea of showing a number of the films. Now, we heard earlier about how the media world and how the films in particular have been grappling with the sort of questions that often we're not talking about in church. So a programme of rolling out to the whole community invitations to come and watch films like Ex Machina and Gattaca and Her and Matrix and so on.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
I don't know if there's any ice hockey fans. I'm a mild ice hockey fan. But Mark Gretzky, one of the leading ice hockey players, was asked once what would he attribute to being his success in the game? And he said, my success can be attributed to this. I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck is going. And I do think there is a prophetic mandate that the church has that I think we shouldn't be fearful about asking the questions and thinking long-term into the future. What if? We probably have the monopoly, we can be as bold as to say that, on future vision and future where we're going. And I think we can be bolder in that, in engaging that.
Can I just ask one other question, which I don't think detracts from that, but I think we're called to be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves, aren't we? Are there any pitfalls as we get engaged in asking these questions and getting engaged in the debate? Are there any pitfalls for the church?
I think that absolutely concur with what you said about curiosity. I mean, Einstein famously said, didn't he, the key thing is to never lose your childlike curiosity. And it was Chesterton who said when God created the world's first flower, he looked at it and said, "This is amazing, let's do it again," and kept saying that until he had a garden. There's a mischievousness in the nature of God. I think, though, the thing we have to be wary of at the same time, it's a dual thing, at the same time, is that we don't cease to be polemic about the things on which we need to be polemic. So there are issues on which we must ask questions, like most of this futurism material. There's more questions than there is answers by virtue of the fact that the future is by definition unpredictable. But there's also the polemic of when it comes to the core of redemption and justification and salvation, all those things. Those are areas where we are quite polemic. And I think in some quarters we've got churches who go too far that way and end up in a legalistic trap. And on the other side, we've got churches who ask so many questions of these issues that they start asking questions of the core issues. Do you understand what I'm saying? And somewhere in the middle, I think, is the way of Christ, which is very difficult to find a lot of the time. And I know that's not what you're suggesting at all, but I think Christian leaders, we need to bear that creative tension, I suppose it is.
Yeah, okay, so here's one of the big existential questions. Decades ago, Jacques Ellul wrote the book The Technological Society. What he said in that book was that what marks out a society as technological is not what it does, but the way it thinks. It's not in the accelerated, exponential increase in its knowledge and way of doing things. It's the way it shapes our thinking about it. So that, for example, the things that traditionally were thought of in terms of providence for a Christian are now thought of in terms of artifice. We make things. We make war. We make love. We make babies. So that the whole way of thinking of our society today is a different way from a traditional way of thought. Now, we want to ask as Christians, how do you actually still hold on to a God who's those things you had on the screen just now, a sovereign providential God, at the same time as using technology for the best benefit of mankind.
Would you want to add anything to that? No. Well, Matt James, who you met, Paul Perkin, who I should have introduced at the beginning, who is, as he's already said, is a church leader in London, and Mal as well. I don't know about you, but I'm very excited that actually what each of them are illustrating, and I'm sure that those of you who are here will think as well, is we have a huge opportunity as Christians to be raising those questions and framing the debate. We don't want to shy away from that, even though it's complex, but we do need wisdom in how we do it. But what an opportunity. So we want to build on what we've been doing today. But thank you. And I hope that as we have our discussion in a moment, we will build on it with the contributions that you're able to give, which actually will be of tremendous help, I'm sure, to all of us as well. But to the three of you, thank you. Matt, Paul and Mel, thank you.